In the summer of 1885, a dying man sat in a chair on a porch in upstate New York and wrote against the clock. Throat cancer had taken his voice. Morphine managed the pain just enough for him to hold a pencil. His doctors had given him weeks, maybe days. And yet, Ulysses S. Grant kept writing, not because he needed the money, though he did, but because there were things he believed history would get wrong the moment he stopped breathing. He finished his personal memoirs 4 days before he died. Most people who know the book at all remember it as a military autobiography. Campaigns, battles, logistics, the grinding machinery of the Civil War told from the inside. And it is all of those things. But buried within its pages is something that received far less attention than it deserved. A direct, measured, and ultimately prophetic assessment of Robert E. Lee. Not the Lee the country was already beginning to worship, the actual one. Grant did not call Lee a genius. He did not call him unbeatable. He did not call him the greatest general America had ever produced. What he said was considerably more precise and considerably more damning, and the country was in no mood to hear it. By the time Grant's memoirs appeared in print, the machinery of the lost cause was already running at full speed. Former Confederate officers, politicians, and newspaper editors had spent the better part of 2 decades constructing a version of the Civil War that bore only passing resemblance to the one that had actually taken place. In this version, the South had fought not to preserve slavery, but to defend constitutional principle. The Confederate soldier had been a noble figure, outgunned and outnumbered, but sustained by honor. And Robert E. Lee had been a figure so elevated, so morally and militarily superior to anything the North could produce, that his defeat could only be explained by the sheer weight of Union resources. Jubal Early was the architect of much of this. The bitter, unrepentant former general had made it his personal mission after the war to canonize Lee, and he was extraordinarily good at it. He founded the Southern Historical Society, flooded its publications with a carefully curated version of events, and waged a paper war against anyone who challenged the narrative he was building. The Lee that emerged from this project was less a historical figure than a marble statue, cold, perfect, and far removed from the messy record of actual command. Grant saw through it, and his memoirs said so without theatrical language or personal animus. His critique of Lee was structural, not emotional. The first pillar of that critique was what historians would later call attritional aggression. Lee fought offensively at a rate, and with a ferocity that the Confederacy could not sustain. The math was stark. The South had a smaller population, a smaller industrial base, and a far more limited pool of military-age men. Every casualty it suffered was proportionally more damaging than the equivalent Union loss. A nation fighting under those conditions needed a general who understood the asymmetry and built a strategy around it. One who would force the Union to come to him, who would bleed the North's will rather than the South's manpower. Lee did the opposite. He attacked. He attacked when the tactical situation demanded it, when it offered opportunities, and often when it didn't. The 7 Days battles in 1862 cost the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia roughly 20,000 men. The assault on the second day at Gettysburg, the decisions that led to Pickett's charge, these were not the choices of a general who understood what his nation could afford to lose. Grant noticed. In his memoirs, he observed that Lee's aggressive instincts were better suited to an army that could absorb punishment indefinitely, which the Army of Northern Virginia could not. The second pillar of Grant's critique was narrower and cut deeper. Lee thought in Virginia. His strategic vision, as formidable as it was within that theater, rarely extended beyond the borders of the state he was defending. While Grant was commanding across an entire continent, coordinating operations in Georgia with Sherman, pressing along the Mississippi, strangling Confederate supply lines wherever they existed, Lee remained consumed with the tactical situation in front of him. He repeatedly stripped forces from other theaters to reinforce his own army, treating the Confederacy's wider strategic needs as secondary concerns. Grant understood that the war would be won or lost at the level of the whole, not the part. Lee never fully absorbed that lesson, or if he did, he absorbed it too late. None of this appeared in the newspapers much. The popular portrait of Lee as a near mythological commander had already taken root, and it was too useful to too many people to be disturbed by a dying general's careful prose. The country was in the middle of what historians later called reconciliation, the long, painful process by which the North and South worked out a shared national identity after the devastation of the 1860s. That process required concessions, and one of the largest was the implicit agreement to treat the Confederate cause and its leaders with a deference that the actual history did not warrant. Lee was the centerpiece of that arrangement. Elevating him served everyone. The South got its hero and the implication that it had been beaten only by numbers, not by judgment or will. The North got a reunified nation, functional commerce, and the comfortable fiction that it had beaten someone worthy of being beaten. The freedmen and women whose lives had been the central question of the war got very little out of the bargain, but that was largely the point. Grant, who had spent his presidency fighting for black civil rights with a genuine commitment that history has underplayed for decades, was not the kind of man to participate comfortably in this arrangement. His memoirs carried no malice toward Lee personally. He described their meeting at Appomattox with a quiet dignity that reflected well on both of them. But he refused to manufacture reverence he didn't feel. What he wrote instead was honest, and honesty was not what the moment required. The vindication came slowly, over decades, mostly through academic channels that the general public never much followed. In 1977, historian Thomas Connelly published a book called The Marble Man, which examined the process by which Lee's reputation had been constructed after the war. Connelly showed, with meticulous sourcing, how much of what passed for fact about Lee was the product of deliberate mythologizing by men with clear ideological interests. The marble statue Jubal Early and his circle had built was, in many places, covering something quite different from what lay beneath. Other historians followed. Grady McWhiney and Perry Jameson's statistical work on Confederate casualty rates demonstrated precisely what Grant had argued from memory, that Lee's offensive campaigns had cost the Confederacy a percentage of its forces that it could not regenerate and did not survive. The numbers made the case in a language that was difficult to argue with. By the end of 1862 alone, Lee had expended through battle a proportion of his effective strength that Grant's more methodical opponents had not approached in twice the time. More recently, Gordon Rhea's exhaustive scholarship on the Overland Campaign dismantled what remained of the old argument that Grant had simply overwhelmed Lee with brute force and indifferent generalship. The opposite was true. Grant outmaneuvered Lee repeatedly in the spring of 1864, forced engagements on terms he chose rather than terms Lee imposed, and bent the strategic situation steadily and purposefully toward an outcome he had planned from the beginning. The butcher's bill was real, and it was terrible, but the framing that had attached to it, Grant as the unthinking hammer versus Lee as the brilliant but doomed artist, was, historians found, almost entirely backward. What Grant had written in those last weeks of his life, in pain, with the clock running out, was not bitterness or rivalry. It was the professional judgment of the man who had beaten Lee, who had spent close to a year in direct contest with him across the fields of Virginia, and who had formed conclusions based on evidence rather than mythology. He did not say Lee was mediocre. He said Lee was a good general, fighting with significant advantages in terrain and interior lines, and that the reputation Lee carried was outsized relative to what the record actually showed. He was right. He was right about the offensive casualty rates. He was right about the strategic myopia. He was right that the Army of the Potomac Lee faced before 1864 was not the same army it became, and that Lee's record against it reflected that gap as much as it reflected Lee's own gifts. The country didn't listen because it didn't want to. The story it was building required a different Lee than the one Grant described, and a different Grant than the one who had written those pages. More blunt instrument than military mind, more lucky than capable. Both characterizations were false, but both were useful, and usefulness in the years after the Civil War often carried more weight than accuracy. Ulysses Grant finished his memoirs on July 16, 1885. He died 5 days later. The book sold 300,000 copies in its first year, made his family financially secure, and was widely praised as a literary achievement. And then, in the critical matter of what it actually said about Lee, was politely and thoroughly ignored. He had told people what he believed the record showed. He had been precise about it, honest about it, and calm about it. He had done everything a man could do from the page. It took the rest of the world the better part of a century to catch up.